Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here at the Chamber of Labor. My name is Markus Matterbauer. I'm the head of the Department for Economics and Statistics here at the Chamber. As you may know, the Chamber's major tasks do not only concern services for our members, such as legal advice and support on labor laws, and in the labor courts, or making politics on behalf of the employees, but also doing research in the interest of workers and consumers. And the Department of Economics at the Chamber of Labor is one of these research institutes. The department has been founded in 1957 to bring new economic ideas to Austria and to the trade unions. Well, the most relevant new idea of this time in 1957 was Keynesianism, which was then widely neglected at the universities. But the Chamber of Labor and the Austrian Institute of Economic Research have been the major contributors to the dissemination of Keynesian ideas in Austria. This has also provided the foundations for Austro-Keynesian economic policy, which determined policy making in the 70s and 80s, one of the most successful periods in economic history of this country. One of the major new economic ideas of our times is the economics of happiness. The advancement of research in this area is inseparably connected to the work of Professor Andrew Oswald, who will be introduced in a minute. In happiness economics and behavioral economics in general, microeconomic research has taken its strongest enhancement in recent years. Here, from my point of view, economic research is contributing to the analysis of real-world problems, from questions of fairness to the determinants of well-being to herd behavior on financial markets. There's an obvious connection to Keynesian macroeconomics in all of these areas, and I think that the realistic micro foundation based on the findings of behavioral economics, together with a profound macroeconomic foundation based on post-Keynesian insights, for instance, could provide a proper framework for the renaissance of economics. A renaissance of economics as a science interested in the analysis of real-world problems and real-world phenomena, characterized by pluralism in methods and theories, cooperating with the other social sciences, and also contributing to make the world a better place to live in. Therefore, I'd like to thank the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network for tonight's cooperation and wish you all a very interesting and happy evening. Thank you.
My name is Corinna Fehr, and I welcome you warmly to our seventh event of the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network. VBEN, what is that? VBEN, we are a platform for scientists, for decision makers in business and politics, and for interested people. And we believe really in the results out of behavioral economics and experimental economics. And behavioral economics, what is that? We always say it's standard economics, plus the behavior of people, plus the power out of the results of experiments. And that means it's evidence-based, and that's really new. Yeah? And the power of this we want to share with you, and that's the reason why we are here. Well, I mean, who is VBEN? VBEN, that's the University of Vienna with Jean-Robert Thiron. It's the Austrian Federation of Industries with Clemens Wallner, who can't be here today. It's the Styria Media Group. It's the Austrian Press Agency. It's Netzkundig with Eberhard Laut. It's Fair Advice and Partners in Zurich. And it's me, Corinna Fehr. I'm an expert in conflict and project management and president of the VBEN.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jean-Robert Thiron. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Vienna, and I'm also the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of the VBEN, the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network. So we've already heard that the VBEN is a platform to bring together researchers in the fields of behavioral and experimental economics and practitioners from economy, society, non-government organization, and so on, and the general public, to transfer the knowledge from the university to the interested community. But we're not interested in one-way communication only. We're interested in discussion, and this is also reflected in the organization of this event. So first of all, we don't hold the events at the university, but we try to get out into society, and we're very happy to be here today at this wonderful location. Thank you very much, Mr. Malterbauer, for allowing us to be here. And we will not only bring excellent world-class academics to talk about their research in a way that is accessible to lay people, interested lay people, but also we want comments by top-notch practitioners, and then afterwards discussion. So let me start by saying a few words about today's top-notch practitioner, Ms. Doris Tomanek. She's an economist by training, which of course helps with such a topic. But I think what qualifies her a lot to speak to us today is that she's of Austria's, one of Austria's top human resource specialists. So she has more than 30 years experience in this business. She has worked in leading positions in various industries, starting from mobile oil to Coca-Cola, and more recently in banking. So she's a top executive at Bank Austria. She's the head of human capital. And she's also a member of the board of UniCredit Bank Austria and executive vice president at UniCredit Group. So she will give a comment to the presentation, the keynote lecture that we hear, and then there's ample opportunity for questions and answers, for discussions, and we very much look forward to your input. And we've been doing this a few times already. I think it's the seventh event, okay, I managed to count. And usually, time we have to cut the discussion at some point, but then we step out and have a drink together and some finger food, and that's the opportunity to continue the discussions, but also to network a little bit. After all, it's the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network. That's an important part of it. So let me now briefly say a few words about the topic. Everyone wants to be happy. But what makes us happy? Yeah. Philosophers have mulled over this question for centuries. Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, you name it. Yeah? And they brought our wisdom to us. But we now have a new approach to this question. And this approach is quantitative social science. So we let the data speak instead of introspection. So the general idea behind part of this research, at least when it started, is quite simple. You ask people, how happy are you these days? And, give me a number from 1 to 10. And then you ask lots and lots of people, and you know things about these people, their characteristics, and then you can say something about what kind of people tend to say they're more happy than other people. That's more or less the basic approach of this so-called subjective well-being approach. And this approach has started about 40 years ago, and it has totally reshaped the perspective people have on economics and also economic policy. One lesson we've learned is money isn't everything. That's one big lesson we've learned. Yeah? Economists tended to be, earlier on, were very focused on this question. Also, economic growth isn't everything. Actually, one of the pioneers in the field, Richard Easterlin, came up with this quite provocative finding that economic growth and happiness are not really linked. And that then triggered a lot of follow-up research to understand, well, if it isn't money, if it isn't growth, what is it that makes us happy? So ultimately, the aim of this research is and that's very much in the spirit of what Corinna said, to create a better world, and also what Mr. Waterbauer said, a better and yes, a happier world. And to know how to do this, you need to have the basic scientific knowledge that we will, some of it we will hear tonight. But of course, there are also problems with this type of research. Perhaps we can mention some of it in the discussions, and there are certainly many open issues. So the research is going on and is going beyond these simple correlations that I mentioned before. And Andrew Oswald is one of the pioneers that went beyond these simple correlations, for example, in studying panels, in which, for example, researchers can study exactly causal effect, what happens to a particular person when some event happens to this person. So there is a lot of progress has happened in this field, and Andrew Oswald is one of the pioneers that contributed to this field. So I'm extremely pleased and honored to have him here today. Thank you very much for coming, and I would like to very briefly introduce him to you. He is, as you've already heard, he's our Professor of Economics and Behavioral Science in the University of Warwick currently, but he has taught in many universities before, at the London School of Economics, Oxford, and has been visiting professor in many very prestigious universities, including Dartmouth, Harvard, and of course Zurich, where I come from, you may have guessed. He also serves on the boards of many prestigious journals, including the Economic Journal, and is also on the board of reviewing editors of the journal Science, the most important general science journal. He has written an influential book, which I enjoyed reading when I was a young academic, The Wage Curve, which is a classic in this field. He published in many top journals, including the American Economic Review and Quarterly Journal of Economics. Professor Oswald is an eminent labor economist, so he has a great name as a labor economist. He made important contribution to understanding the behavior of unions, as is of course an important element here. But I think his passion, what perhaps started out, is understanding unemployment. Why do we see unemployment? What can we do about it? How can we clamp down on unemployment? And he studied it from many perspective, including unexpected perspectives, like how is home ownership related to unemployment, for example. And an interesting, important contribution. Or oil price shocks, more obvious perhaps. So about 20 years ago, he started to work on the economics of happiness, and he has investigated many fascinating aspects of happiness, including, just to give you some ideas or indications of the broad range of what he's investigated, including the question whether winning the lottery actually makes a lasting difference on your happiness. Important question, how much is our happiness driven by genetics rather than the environment? Of course, if everything is just driven by genetics, there's just some happy people and just some unhappy people, there wouldn't be much scope to try to influence it. So he has also worked on that, trying to find a happiness gene even. How happiness depends on what you eat, a very ongoing research. That also sounds very fascinating and very, very relevant. But also issues like divorce. How does divorce affect your happiness? If you're already on the verge of divorcing, is your happiness going up or down if you actually break up? So this is also a question you can, and Professor Oswald has studied with great virtuosity. So today he will talk about the combination of happiness and work. So he's an eminent labor economist, so he is really the person to talk about this combination. He will talk about what kind of boss makes you happy, or whether happy people are more productive in the workplace, topics like this. So he's ideally suited to address this topic in an ideally suited place to discuss on this issue, and so we are very grateful for being here. Thank you very much, Professor Oswald, for being here. Thank you.
It's very nice to be back in Vienna, and how kind of you to come tonight. You know the topic. I'm going to be interested in questions like how happy are workers, if you look across the European nations, What determines job satisfaction at the personal level and at the level of the organisation? Can we work out how organisations, how companies might raise job satisfaction levels? How important are bosses? One might think very important. We've generally been brought up with the notion, at least in Britain we have, that bosses tend to be overpowering and often bad and make people's lives troubling at work. Is that really true? Does happiness make people more productive? I'm going to describe a randomized controlled trial where we do our best to answer that kind of question. Just to set the last one a little bit in some kind of context, you probably know that Google famously thinks it's very important for its employees to be happy and that helps them to be creative, or at least that's the blurb they like to put on their websites. So is all this just hype? This is a statement from a prominent Google person. We know that health, family, and well-being are important. We've also noticed that employees who are happy demonstrate increased motivation. I mean, that's a very interesting idea. It's really a scientific claim, and I'll try and describe different kinds of evidence, randomized evidence, and, in other words, experimental evidence and observational evidence on that. I hope we can take it for granted that job satisfaction and mental well-being matter in themselves to us as individuals, to organizations, to whole countries. More broadly, there seem to be, we're discovering from many different scientific angles, rather powerful linkages, though we don't understand them completely, between the mind and the body. And you can see here, ladies and gentlemen, that I've clipped in an old photograph of myself from my youth. Let's just start with basics. I'll talk for about 30 minutes, by the way, not very long, and then throw it open for questions. Job satisfaction and work happiness have been studied in two broad ways. I'll describe each of those. One is just to ask people what it is that they want in a job. Very simple, and we can do that in a fairly unscripted way and listen to their answers. That seems an important approach, not necessarily the only thing that you'd want to do. People want places to dance at work, they might want special hats and so on. We can ask them about all of that. Method two, this is more what somebody wants to do if they've been trained in a PhD in economics. They've been trained to avoid the straightforward way of looking at the world quite often. We can look for underlying patterns. Now here we behave very much as epidemiologists do, medical statisticians, many other kinds of scientists. Typically we'll take a random sample of people, we'll measure some things that we care about, then we'll look for the underlying patterns. We can think in terms of a piece of graph paper, just a scatter of points. We're looking for an underlying relationship. Let's start with the first, though. What do employees say that they want in jobs? Here we have, in this particular part, we're drawing on about 35,000, 40,000 randomly sampled workers across Europe, and they're asked a fairly open-ended question. You might like to think what you would say if you were asked that. People's two top priorities are job security. That's not what I had predicted. And work that is interesting. These are the first two things that people say, large random samples across Europe. The next four priorities, people like to work independently. Undoubtedly, that's partly why I chose to be a researcher and work in a university. People like autonomy. And sometimes in organizations, in whole systems, it's easy to forget that humans really benefit from that if they can get it. They want a career path. They want a job that's useful for society. So we've done what? We've done 5 now, have we? 5 or 6 now. And you'll notice something hasn't been mentioned yet. And that's money, yes. Labour economists are brought up to think that although money is not the only thing that matters, it's absolutely the key motivator. And you ask people open-ended questions and they haven't got to money yet. And high income, of course, does show up eventually. Let's now go to the statistical literature. This is more like epidemiology. This is not asking people, do you think it's a good idea to eat apples and not smoke? This is just studying people's health. Do you smoke? Do you eat apples? And we look for the underlying patterns. That's the tradition of epidemiology, and of course, a great deal of applied statistics. And it's a different way, another complementary way of learning about the world. We estimate equations where something gets determined. You can think of it as a giant menu, if you like, or a giant recipe. We want to create spaghetti bolognese, and that's job satisfaction on the left. And we have to work out, well, we need to put in lamb and tomato and garlic and herbs and whatever else heck goes into spaghetti bolognese. And then we can statistically measure, say this is the taste of the spaghetti bolognese, and this gradient here tells us, well, what's the value of more tomato or whatever it is. That's all we're doing here. Here's a typical kind of survey question. This is across the European nations. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your job? From 7, completely satisfied, down to 1. When I first started doing this kind of work in 1993, I thought these kinds of questions are never going to tell us anything reliable or interesting. But through the years, I've learned better. Here's some good news. In our continent, people really like their jobs, on average. The most common answer on a scale from 1 to 7, where 7 is completely satisfied, is a 6. That's the most common number that's given. And you can see the average comes out just at about 5.5 out of 7. I was raised on the novels of Charles Dickens, if you know who that was in English literature. And many of us are brought up with the notion that we are subjugated by work. I suppose Karl Marx said something similar, and so on. If you look at the data, people actually seem to like their jobs a lot. Not everyone, of course, but typically. Any guesses on the most satisfied and least satisfied countries? Well, if you know your geography, that is Switzerland. Where are the Swiss here? That tends to come top of the job satisfaction league, and the East European countries generally don't do very well on this standardized European measure. Here are the findings on job satisfaction. So now I'm thinking about the underlying statistical patterns. We're not asking people how important these things are. We're looking to see whether higher or lower levels of these influences show up statistically. Pay, of course, enters positively. Large workplaces are negative. In other words, this is holding everything else constant. The smaller your workplace, the happier people are. We don't understand why that is. Probably our best guess is that the larger you get in an organization, the more impersonal it becomes. Women tend to report higher job satisfaction scores than men, and I can come back to that in the questions if you want. Job security, of course, comes through very positive. Education is essentially a 0. Highly educated individuals in a society always find this surprising. They think that you've got to have a PhD or a brilliant undergraduate degree to enjoy work. In fact, lots and lots of different regular people enjoy their jobs. And autonomy, independence, that comes through in a very positive way. What is the single strongest predictor of job satisfaction among European workers? What is the single... I haven't mentioned it yet. I should have a prize for this, really. I haven't done this slide before. Any guesses?
Gender.
I don't think I...
Gender?
Gender? No. No. Is that a clue? This is The Devil Wears Prada. It's a great movie. Yes, the boss. In our equations, what the boss does, and the more I say it, the more obvious it seems in retrospect, but a huge amount of the job satisfaction literature ignores the boss. In our work, we're finding the boss matters enormously. It's the single strongest statistical predictor, and in particular the level of what you might describe as the technical competence of the boss matters. We get a lot of statistical power from people answering to the question, in an emergency, could your boss do your job? And if they tick yes, then they tend themselves, controlling for everything, to be considerably happier in the workplace. So it seems that having some kind of expert, somebody who really understands the nuts and bolts, may be extremely important. For the technical people here, I'll talk about the value of bosses from the Journal of Labour Economics and a paper I have a hand in recently in the Industrial and Labour Relations Review. And if you're interested in this boss competence role, I should plug the work of Amanda Goodall, who works at Cass Business School in London. Today is not the day for the details, but if you just look at the heights of this and think very intuitively, the first bar is giving us the quantitative influence of the boss on your job satisfaction. This is money, that's education, this is the public sector, industry, and so on. I won't do the details, but you get the punchline that bosses are really extremely influential. What else is known about job satisfaction? Well, of course, we do think about pay, and the evidence, I think, has grown tremendously that if you want to understand how happy Mr. Oswald is, don't ask him how many euros are paid into his bank account, or even pounds. Ask him about how is his pay relative to those other professors in the corridor. It turns out that in particular, the ordinal rank of pay, or in other words, am I the 31st best paid person at Warwick University or the 3,331st best paid person? The ordinal rank seems very important. And that may go back to our primeval roots even, that we care about where we lie in great ape hierarchies, I don't know. This has come to seem to me natural, but it's not at all the tradition, even now, of what we teach students. On autonomy, if you are a manager or you have any executive role or leadership role, you may like to know one of our most interesting findings is that who controls the pace of work is important. Human beings don't mind working hard. We find that if customers or colleagues control the pace of work, people are fine with that. What humans don't like is when some machine is controlling how hard they have to work, and they're not very keen on bosses controlling how hard they have to work. But what you might call the people that they care about, the intrinsic demand, colleagues and customers, that seems fine. Again, if you're a manager, I would advise you to give your employees small freedoms. In some of our work, we get a really powerful effect from just those who tick the box. I can move my desk at work a little bit if I want to do that. I can move my desk. That shows up strongly throughout our job satisfaction equations. There's a life cycle pattern. If you're 45 years old in this room, I'm afraid I have bad news for you, at least at the moment. There's considerable evidence that our job satisfaction is U-shaped through life. That minimises actually a little bit before 40. We don't know why this is, but it's seen in many different countries across the world, and it mirrors a general midlife crisis effect. If I take data from all over the Western world and I plot people's happiness, very often even I do no statistical adjustment at all, so I don't adjust for their income or marriage and so on. But even more powerfully I do. We find again and again there's a kind of U-shape through life. We don't know why this is. I'm sure it's true in Austria. I've studied so many countries, at some point we must have Austria in our data. So there really does appear to be a midlife low. And this was true in the 1970s. It's backed up by many other different kinds of evidence. These are British data that boiled down to the equivalent the other way up for the probability of clinical depression. And here's a monkey. Why am I showing you that? Because some colleagues and I recently published in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Science a replication of the U-shape for chimpanzees and orangutans. What about promotion? Should you want to be promoted? A lot of us think about this. At one stage in life I thought, do I want to be a dean? Do I want to be the president of a university? Even if I could have been, of course. So is that a good idea as a life goal? A few years ago, Sherman and co. published a paper demonstrating that leaders in their samples had lower levels of stress measured by cortisol. And some argued that that was a reason why we should want to be on top of our organization, because then we're the least stressed people. Everyone else has to do what we tell them, I suppose. They used military officers, government officials, and so on. But I'm afraid I don't believe that causal mechanism. colleagues and I decided to try and investigate that by looking at a much larger sample, following people through time and seeing what came first. You see, the Sherman study is just at a point in time, and it's true that leaders have lower stress levels measured their way. But we don't know who chose to be a leader. And the bottom line in this kind of paper is that it's the healthy people who got promoted. So in fact, there's a vast literature within social epidemiology which more or less claims that if you get pushed to the top of your organization, your health will improve. And that may be true, but all I can do is tell you that our longitudinal work finds it works the other way round, perhaps commonsensically, that intrinsically healthy people have fantastic energy and they work their way up to be the head of Austria or Great Britain or Coca-Cola or whatever it is. That's been backed up by other kinds of work. Promotions, other colleagues around the world have found, don't have much effect on happiness actually, but stress levels some years later rise. And perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by that as we offer large sums of money to people for being CEO. Here's another issue. I'm afraid I don't know whether it's an important one in your country, but it's a topic that sweeps across the Western world. Should I know what you earn? And should all my students be able to look up what I earn? All my colleagues on the corridor, or an even worse prospect, should they be able to look up what I earn? Is so-called pay transparency a good idea? I assume Austria doesn't have full pay transparency. So is it a good idea? You can see arguments, and this is often complicated by the very important debate over gender, actually, over men and women. Should pay be public knowledge? The Financial Times last year ran a big piece called Pay Transparency is the Last Taboo, and as an approximation, the newspaper argued that all pay should be publicly known. I think there are arguments for that, but just let me run you through one difficulty. A recent study was done at the University of California at Berkeley, and there was an attempt to answer this question, probably to answer a different question, but the results on pay transparency came out. It's called Inequality at Work by Card and others. What they did, to give you a rough sense, is they sent an email to you saying, did you realize at Berkeley, because we're a public employer, you can, if you click on this website, you can find out what all the other people in your corridor earn. Would you like to get that email? So they open their email. I can find out what every person in my office earns. And a lot of people clicked. So what happened after that? The card team measured the quit rate, the job satisfaction rate, and so on. And what they found was that the well-paid were quite unaffected. So I'm relatively well-paid at Warwick. I discover that. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. I don't get any benefit from it. Now think about the other professors on the corridor who've also hit the click button. Well, it turns out that, perhaps as you might expect, in retrospect anyway, it's the ones who turn out, who discover they are relatively badly paid, they get extremely grumpy and they start to quit. So there may be good reasons, equity reasons, all sorts of reasons why we want to throw pay public. But what will happen if your country does it, and mine, is that the people who are relatively well paid will not benefit. But on average, you will create, at least in this sphere, a lot of unhappiness. And that's possibly because humans, we're all inclined to overestimate our own abilities, or we can always think of, well, my strength is this, and Mr. X and Ms. Y, they have other strengths, but I think my kind of strength is particularly important and should show up in my pay packet. Let me tell you a few more things, and then I'll throw it open for questions. Is work getting more stressful? We hear quite a lot about mental strain at work. This is something I know that's a live issue for human resource professionals around the world. I've talked to many. The mental strain levels, stress among their employees, that's a really big topic for them. Due to the work of somebody called Francis Green and colleagues, we do have some signs of work of rising levels of high-strain jobs. That gives you a sense of it. I don't have the latest data. I don't know whether the research team stopped. And they measure high strain by a very high necessary work rate and low discretion. So that is one piece of evidence. Should organizations want their workers to be happy or not? You might think if I employ a bunch of research assistants, I don't care whether they're happy. I get them into my office and I say, I'm going to give you money, and what I want in return is effort. Whether you enjoy it or not, I don't care, because I'm giving you money. This is a trade. Can you cope? Right? You might think that's a perfectly legitimate attitude, and I have heard that attitude from employers. It's a business deal. Why should they care, Mr. Oswald, about the happiness of their people? That's not what they're doing. But very probably, yes, there is growing evidence that happiness seems to have a causal effect on productivity. So if I make you happier, I will make you more productive. What my research team cannot tell you is how that happens. I'll just run you through. There's a recent paper in what's called the Journal of Labour Economics. We took 500 or 600 people into the lab, created a standardized white-collar task, and then randomized whether we made some people happier or not. We had a control group we didn't make happier. We did the happiness intervention many different ways. My favorite was getting a British comedian, that they had to watch for 10 minutes. They all laughed and laughed at the British comedian. Then they did the standardized task, but we did a lot of other things. On the first round, when we sent this paper in, we showed that making people happier raised their productivity 12%, quite a bit relative to the controls. We submitted that to a journal, and they said, this is fine, Andrew, but it's in a lab, it's quite a small happiness change. Can you do something out in the real world really big? Well, I can't transform these people's lives, I thought, can I? But we hit on the idea of making them, or studying what happened when they became unhappy. We hit on the idea of, we took in a couple of hundred people, we measured their productivity, and then we asked them whether there'd been any tragedies in their extended family in the last couple of years. Not to them, to their extended families. And we found that these tragic events were associated with the people, just randomly picked, being less happy and also being less productive. So we had our own happiness intervention, you might say, where we got everyone to laugh, and we allowed nature with a capital N, because I'm not allowed to kill off students' parents as a way to find out how the students will feel. We relied on nature. So that's what we did. There have been a number of observational studies, longitudinal studies. One of my favourites is by a man called Edmonds, a very talented researcher at London Business School, and he showed that if you look at the companies that get in the best company list, do I have the 100 best companies to work for and so on, control for what you can, those companies really do go on to have better share performance. And a related study by a man called Bockerman also finds that if you measure job satisfaction today, those companies controlling for everything really do go on to have better performance. So I've come to believe that happiness has a causal effect on human productivity. In our randomized trial, it wasn't that people on these tasks had a better error rate. They didn't do them better, but they did far more of them in the time. So it appears that if you randomize happiness onto people, if that doesn't sound too strange an idea, it's as though they get more energy. They do not improve as doers of a task, but they can just do more of them. And we have a theory in the paper about why that is. Just before I close, of course these things matter to us as humans and to us as members of organizations and societies. But I do think the epidemiology literature, jokes apart, does have something of real note. A man called Cohen at Carnegie Mellon for many years ran interesting experiments where he squirted viruses up people's noses. They were paid to do this. And he discovered that some humans were good at warding off the symptoms and others went down with the flu. The happiness of the person, he eventually realized their mental health, their mental state, was a key predictor of whether they were likely or not to get the flu with the same kind of virus infection. An even more memorable study was published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology. I had to become an economist because I couldn't say psychoneuroendocrinology. Possibly not everyone in the room reads this, but here's a kind of sentence from that paper. It's by a man from a very interesting King's College London team led by a man called Weinman. Every subject received a standard 4mm punch biopsy. Do you know what that means? Yeah, that's not too good, actually. I don't know what they had to be paid to do this. That's what a punch biopsy looks like, and I won't be blowing that up for you. In other words, the research team took a chunk of flesh out of the arms of these people. And what the research team has shown in many settings is that happier people heal more quickly. You take a standardized puncture wound in a human being, measure with ultrasound, that's what they do, how quickly the wound closes. And the people who are happy, of course, before they get the puncture wound or anything else, they have a faster, I don't know what they pay them to do that, they have a faster healing rate. And again, nobody in the world understands this, by the way, but again, it's rather consistent with the notion that happiness, somehow, you might say, the pool of resources in the mind, that's how I think about it. The mind has a pool of resources to defend itself. And it can defend itself against a physical attack by transferring resources in some way. And it can defend itself against psychological shocks, bereavement, and so on. But how these reserves work, how the transfers are done, or even whether that's the right way to think, nobody in the world knows. Happier humans heal up more quickly. Let me state the conclusions that I'd be interested to answer questions and listen to your points. Despite some gloomy talk, I've come to believe that it's people with bad bosses who are unhappy with their work and so on who do a lot of the talking, and that's perhaps why we think that workplaces are worse than they actually are, because the ones who are happy perhaps keep more quiet. Job satisfaction is actually rather high on a sensible measure, I think, across our kinds of countries. Happy workers, having them, despite the notion that I'm just in the business, if I'm a firm, of giving you money and you give me effort, and why should I care about you? It does appear that probably there's a genuine benefit to organizations from happy workers. But how that energy flow or goodwill flow or whatever it is works, I don't know as a researcher. Very possibly Doris has seen such things in action and she'll be able to give you another angle. Happiness is probably valuable for human health. Many scientists are now arguing that happier people intrinsically live longer. There's a famous study of nuns, young women in female orders growing up, where it was discovered that writing happy words when you were about 19 years old was predictive of how long the nuns went on to live. That was considered important because nuns in these nunneries, I suppose, in these religious orders have very sheltered lives, eat the same diet. And that study is still ongoing. And somehow or other, happiness has a protective effect, some researchers believe. Bosses are very important. Although it's a great movie, the line I always liked was, "Is there some reason my coffee isn't here?" She says, "Has she died or something?" Talking about her assistant. It's a terrific movie if you haven't seen it. And boss competence is, in our data anyway, randomized samples of America and Britain, the strongest predictor of job satisfaction. So the idea of the bad boss is actually, I suspect, is an important one in principle, but our latest work, which I can't share with you in detail, is that bad bosses are relatively rare in Europe. Our latest paper is called "How Common Are Bad Bosses?" but it's under review, so I won't describe the results. There's some evidence that mental strain at work is going up in a country like mine and possibly others. And humans love small freedoms. I do, you very probably do. They're cheap to give. So if you are some kind of boss, it's very probably a good and cheap strategy. I'll stop there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening.
Good evening from my side as well. I'm very honored to be here and to be able to listen to the speech of our distinguished professor in an area where I'm working on a daily basis. We in Bank Austria at the moment are going through a relatively big restructuring, or we are just coming out of that. And motivation of people or engagement is becoming an even more important topic than in the past. Listening to all the facets and elements that were mentioned, you can see that this topic is definitely a very complex one. Now, being a practitioner in the field for 30 years, we have to come up with solutions and ideas on how do we spend the money that we have to really get the people not only paid but also motivated. So we really have to come up with solutions in a world that is getting more complicated every day. I still remember when I started in human resources 30 years ago, there was very little data on, or we were using very few data in making our decisions about people strategy. So it was really mostly about paying people, right, hopefully, give them trainings, and this was more or less it. I think in the last 10, 15 years, the human resources profession has become a lot more data-driven in the way we develop our people strategies. And for example, in terms of understanding if our people are engaged or satisfied, we do, like many other companies, surveys, very regular surveys that we do across the whole organizations. We ask people not only a question, are you satisfied in your job? We ask them more specifically, do they understand the strategy of the company? How do they evaluate their bosses? So we ask these kinds of questions as well. We ask them, are you ready to go the extra mile? This is, for example, a predictor for us. If the engaged people are actually running faster and are ideally at the end more productive. We also ask questions like, are you planning to leave the company? Because turnover rates or fluctuation rates are also important for a company because there is a high cost in replacing people. So these are some of the elements. I heard in the speech that in Western countries, the people are more satisfied in the job than in CE countries. This is actually not something I can subscribe because in our UniCredit environment, we operate also in quite a number of Central and Eastern European countries. And when we compare the engagement levels in Eastern European countries and in countries like Austria, Germany, and Italy, in the Eastern countries, we have a much higher level of engagement than we have in the Western countries. Now, it's probably pretty natural because the environment is such that in the Western countries, we have more restructuring in banking. In the Eastern countries, we still have a lot more growth. We also have a lot younger people in the CE countries, and I agree with you that younger people generally at the beginning of their career, their job motivation is higher. We also see the facts that, because we analyze the statistics also in age groups, so we do see that in the middle ages, people are least satisfied. So generally at the beginning of the career and at the end of the career, the people are mostly engaged. So this I can subscribe also from a practical perspective. One interesting aspect is the element of pay. I also agree that it becomes less and less important. I can agree that once people figure out, however they do that they are paid less than the colleague, then it becomes a problem. However, one interesting aspect, for example, in one of our countries, it's Russia, the engagement level is very high, but the fluctuation rate is also high, and it's because of money. So sometimes in some industries and countries, you see different things than what you expect as a standard. I hope I explained that properly now. Then I wanted to look at another, one example, because you were explaining all this research on how money motivates people or not. We also, from an HR perspective, sometimes do exercises with people where you put them in a room and let them work in groups on some exercises. And the interesting results are always when you motivate them with money on simple tasks, it works. So that is probably also what you are saying. Simple tasks, they do faster with money as a reward. The more complex the task is, the less money works. So that's just another element related to money. This was the money. The topic of job security. We also see that job security is important. However, I think it's changing quite dramatically because the younger people, when they enter the professional work life, they realize that it's not going to be anymore as it was in the past. I have the experience that until a few years ago in banking, when we hired young people and I was asking them, why are you joining our bank? They were telling me, because it's a safe job, and my parents told me that, my friends, my uncle, whatever. So I think they were influenced by the old generation that was seeing job security as the most important factor to get into a certain area. Now, I think probably since 3 years, this has completely changed, and people are actually looking for areas like interesting job, can I advance? Actually, is it a large organization where probably if one area is restructured, I can actually get another job in another area? So that's to job security. Yeah, and the topic of the boss. Another one of the most interesting ones that I see. I am a boss, yes. The theory that about the expert leader, I think I would subscribe that because, of course, it's ideal if you have a leader that understands at least broadly what the organization is all about, what the job is all about. But a few perspectives. First, in the past, I think a lot of companies promoted experts because it was kind of obvious that if you're an expert, then you can teach the people and you can do the job. But many of these people did lack completely the leadership skills that they needed and terribly failed in the jobs. For HR, some years ago, I remember we in HR then said, okay, at the end of the day, if you are a boss, you don't need to know anything about your business. If you're a good boss, you can manage in any case. I think that was the other extreme. And I would say we did go away from that definitely. And I do agree, ideally, you have the combination of understanding your job and being a good leader as well, which becomes more complicated on a daily basis as well. I think these were some of my remarks, and I look forward now also to a very interesting interaction, hopefully, and some confrontational questions probably. Thank you.